The morning the HOA president tried to evict my 82-year-old grandfather began like any other at Cedar Lake, quiet, cool, and peaceful. Mist still floated over the water, and Grandpa was already tying a fishing lure on the porch, humming the same old tune he always hummed when he was in a good mood. Nothing about the scene suggested that our day was about to be torn open by the kind of chaos only a power-drunk HOA president could deliver. The first sign of trouble was the sharp, intrusive voice slicing through the calm. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention so much as demand it. A woman in a bright purple blazer, so bright it could probably be seen from space, was stomping up my gravel driveway with the intensity of someone who believed clipboards granted divine authority. She pointed at my grandfather as though he were trespassing on his own family's land. The accusation came quickly, wrapped in a tone that suggested she'd never once in her life heard the word no. Grandpa simply looked up from his fishing lure with the unbothered patience of a man who had outlived wars, political tantrums, half a century of government bureaucracy, and every annoying neighbor he'd ever had. He told her gently that he was only visiting, his voice slow and steady. But this woman, Margaret Sullivan, as she proudly introduced herself, was not someone who cared for gentle voices or common sense. She declared that my property was under HOA jurisdiction, and according to her precious bylaws, Grandpa had overstayed his authorized visit by several days. She was so self-assured, so brimming with righteous authority, that she failed to notice how ridiculous she sounded accusing an elderly man of illegal occupancy. When I stepped out onto the deck with my coffee, she snapped toward me like a guard dog spotting a squirrel. She explained that my grandfather's presence constituted multiple violations observed over the last 23 days. The word observed hung in the air like a bad smell. Grandpa chuckled, realizing she'd been spying on him. That only fueled her indignation as she flipped through her clipboard, listing offenses like fishing without a community permit and operating power tools during quiet hours. Her most dramatic claim was that Grandpa was hosting weekly poker games, which she described as a gambling operation. If only she'd seen the high-stakes prizes, loose quarters, and sugar-free mints. Then came the ultimatum, a formal 72-hour eviction notice. She handed it over like she expected the world to crumble at her feet. Instead, Grandpa stood, tall and calm, and asked her the question that began the unraveling of her entire crusade. He mentioned a county ordinance when she clearly didn't know existed. Watching her confidence falter was like watching a balloon sag as the air leaks out slowly but inevitably. Margaret responded by rattling off more regulations, desperately clinging to her authority, but the cracks were visible. She stormed off afterward, certain she'd won some kind of battle. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have predicted, was that Grandpa wasn't just some old man. He was a former county administrator with decades of experience, deep connections, and an encyclopedic knowledge of property law. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Grandpa was already suited up, digging through legal archives and preparing to visit old colleagues. And when county officials arrived later that day, inspectors, the director of code enforcement, even the county attorney, it became instantly clear just how badly Margaret had miscalculated. The simple morning she tried to evict my grandfather turned into the day her entire reign of intimidation began to collapse. It started with a clipboard and a purple blazer, but it ended with county investigations, financial audits, and Margaret Sullivan facing consequences she had never imagined. What she thought would be a display of power became the moment she learned exactly who she had picked a fight with and why that had been the worst mistake of her life. When Margaret Sullivan's power trip collided with the wrong family, it began as just another self-appointed crusade for the Lakeside Estates HOA president. She had built her identity on enforcing rules no one remembered agreeing to, patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard like it was a badge of honor, and speaking with the kind of arrogance only people intoxicated by tiny amounts of power ever develop. To most residents, she was an unavoidable nuisance, loud, petty, and persistent. But when she turned her attention to our cabin and my 82-year-old grandfather, she crossed into territory she never should have touched. For weeks, she had apparently been watching him. The idea still felt absurd, imagining this woman in her bright purple blazer lurking around the edges of my property, taking photos of an elderly man tying fishing lures or fixing a dock. But Margaret treated each of those moments as if she'd uncovered a criminal enterprise. Grandpa's early morning repairs were violations of quiet hours. His fishing hobby became usage of community resources without a permit. Even the small Tuesday night poker games with other retirees for old men, betting pocket change were, according to her, evidence of a gambling operation. Most families might have panicked under the barrage of notices she delivered. Margaret counted on that. Fear was her greatest tool. Fear of fines, fear of losing property privileges, fear of being dragged before the HOA board. She ruled like a monarchy. She mistook compliance for respect and silence for approval. What she didn't understand, and what she was about to learn in the most humiliating way, was that she had chosen the wrong target this time. My grandfather, Emmett Garrison, had spent 45 years working for Pine Valley County, 2 decades of that as the county administrator. He wasn't just familiar with county law, he helped write it. He knew the land, the jurisdictions, the exemptions, the loopholes, and the history behind every regulation. Margaret was wildly More importantly, He knew people, the inspectors, the department heads, the attorneys. Some he had hired, others he had mentored, many still respected him deeply. Margaret mistook his quiet demeanor for weakness, never imagining that the old man in the faded flannel shirt had more authority in his pinky finger than she did in her entire HOA charter. The moment she handed him that 72-hour eviction notice, the fuse was lit. Grandpa didn't threaten her, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply smiled the way only someone who knows a storm is coming smiles. The next morning he dressed in his old county meeting suit, reviewed legal documents at the kitchen table, and headed into town. By the time he returned, the wheels were already turning. Margaret continued her campaign, the way tyrants do, loud, dramatic, and so. She paraded around the property with a tape measure, photographing the dock, the canoe rack, even the dirt path to the lake. But her power began crumbling the moment the county vehicles rolled into our driveway. 4 officials stepped out: code enforcement, inspectors, and the county attorney himself, and their first question was, "Where is Margaret Sullivan?" When they confronted her about overreach, harassment, and financial irregularities, it became obvious she had never imagined her actions would draw real scrutiny. Her confidence evaporated the instant she realized every decision she'd made, every dollar she'd misused, and every violation she'd fabricated now stood under the authority of people she could not bully. And when she learned that Grandpa was not just some random homeowner, but one of the very people who shaped the county's regulations and had personally mentored several of the officials standing before her, replaced all her practiced superiority. The day ended with her resignation, the beginning of an investigation, and the collapse of the power she'd clung to so tightly. Because when her power trip collided with the wrong family, she finally met someone she couldn't intimidate, outsmart, or control, and it shattered everything she thought she ruled. How a former county administrator exposed an HOA president's corruption is a story that unfolded with a mix of quiet strategy, accumulated wisdom, and the precision that comes from decades of public service. To most people, my grandfather was just an elderly man in a faded flannel shirt, living peacefully at my lakeside cabin and spending his mornings tying fishing lures. But beneath that calm exterior was the mind of someone who had navigated 45 years of county politics, budgets, audits, and bureaucratic battles. He had seen every kind of mismanagement, every form of overreach, and every ambitious official who thought they were untouchable. So when an HOA president with a clipboard, a loud voice, and a shaky grasp of the law tried to evict him from my property, she unknowingly picked the worst possible person to challenge. Margaret Sullivan had built her HOA presidency on intimidation. She issued warnings like confetti, enforced obscure rules no one remembered agreeing to, and treated the Lakeside Estates community as her personal territory. When she marched up my driveway declaring Grandpa an unauthorized occupant, handing over a 72-hour eviction notice, she did it with the theatrical confidence of someone who believed she was invincible. But she never stopped to ask who the quiet man she was threatening actually was. She never imagined she was standing in front of someone who understood property law better than she did, or that he knew exactly where to look if he suspected something was wrong. Grandpa didn't argue with her that morning. He didn't shout, didn't defend himself, didn't panic. He simply nodded, accepted the envelope, and watched her leave. But the moment her SUV disappeared down the road, his entire demeanor shifted. He went inside, opened his old laptop, and began pulling up county records with the ease of someone who hadn't forgotten how the system worked. By sunrise the next day, he was wearing the suit he used to wear to county board meetings, flipping through ordinances and jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I asked what he was planning, he only smiled that patient, dangerous smile that meant he already had a plan forming. His visit to the county offices wasn't a plea for help. It was a reunion with people who respected him deeply, people whose careers he had nurtured. The director of code enforcement, one of the inspectors, and even the county attorney had all worked under him or alongside him at some point. Grandpa didn't need favors. He simply presented them with one question. Had anyone looked into the Lakeside Estates, HOA, lately? That was enough to spark curiosity. And with curiosity came the discovery of multiple homeowner complaints, strange financial transactions, and a pattern of behavior that demanded official review. When the county vehicles arrived at the cabin later that afternoon, the air shifted instantly. Margaret, who had been measuring my dock with a tape measure like she was conducting a criminal investigation, froze as the officials stepped onto the property. And the moment she heard them address Grandpa with respect, calling him Mr. Garrison, greeting him warmly, she realized her entire understanding of the situation had been catastrophically wrong. The officials confronted her with evidence gathered from county archives, public records, and homeowner reports. They questioned her spending, her enforcement methods, and her legitimacy as HOA president. Every accusation she had thrown at my grandfather was dwarfed by the list of violations she herself had accumulated. And as Grandpa quietly stood by, it became clearer with each passing minute that he had orchestrated none of this directly. He had simply pointed the right people toward the right documents. By the end of the confrontation, Margaret's authority had disintegrated. She resigned under pressure, faced an audit of the HOA's finances, and would later accept a plea deal for misappropriation and abuse of power. And the man she had tried to evict, the man she assumed was powerless, was the very person who understood how to bring the truth to light. It didn't take anger or revenge to expose her corruption. It took knowledge, experience, and a lifetime of knowing exactly where misconduct hides and how to shine light on it. The day county officials arrived and Margaret's reign finally crumbled began like any other tense morning at the cabin. Margaret Sullivan had already passed by the property twice, her white SUV creeping along the gravel road like a shark circling prey. By her fifth pass, she wasn't even pretending to be subtle anymore. She parked, stepped out with her clipboard, and began taking photos of everything from the canoe rack to the chipped corner of the dock. She was clearly preparing for another dramatic confrontation, convinced she was building an airtight case against us. What she didn't know was that events were already set in motion that would expose her entire operation. I spotted Grandpa's old Ford pickup rolling into the driveway, but what caught my attention were the 3 vehicles following him, each stamped with official county insignia. When they parked, the air shifted instantly. Margaret was still crouched at the shoreline with her tape measure when a firm voice called her name, a voice filled with the kind of authority even self-appointed tyrants can't ignore. She straightened quickly, brushing imaginary dust from her blazer, clearly confused by the unexpected audience. Walking toward her was Patricia Wong, the director of county code enforcement, dressed in a tailored suit that radiated quiet power. Behind her stood 2 county inspectors and the county attorney, Robert Hazich, carrying tablets, clipboards, and an unmistakable seriousness. Margaret tried to greet them with forced confidence, but it faltered almost immediately when Patricia announced they were there to address multiple concerns regarding the Lakeside Estates, HOA. The color drained from Margaret's face as she stammered questions no one was interested in answering. Then Grandpa stepped forward with the calm familiarity of someone returning home. Patricia greeted him warmly by name, and the inspectors nodded with the kind of respect reserved for someone who had shaped their careers. Margaret blinked rapidly, processing the revelation that the man she'd been attempting to evict was not just an elderly fisherman, but a former county administrator with deep ties to the very people now standing in front of her. The officials wasted no time. Patricia began listing the complaints: harassment, overreach, illegal enforcement, and possible financial mismanagement. Each word landed like a hammer. Margaret tried to interrupt, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the inspectors were already holding up photos, spreadsheets, and records. They cited surveillance equipment purchased with HOA funds, fake violations issued to homeowners, trespassing incidents, and suspicious expenditures labeled as community beautification that suspiciously improved the homes of board members rather than any public areas. It was the first time I watched Margaret truly unravel. Her usual confidence crumbled into defensive rambling, then frantic denial, then trembling silence. She turned from Patricia to the inspectors, then to the county attorney, hoping for an ally and finding none. Every attempt she made to shift blame only made things worse. The officials remained professional but firm, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. She had built her kingdom on intimidation, but the moment real accountability arrived, the illusions she relied on vanished. Grandpa didn't gloat. He didn't speak unless addressed. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching with quiet sadness. Later, I would understand why he had seen dozens of Margarets in his career, small-time enforcers who let authority seep into their bloodstream, until they believed themselves untouchable. He knew how these stories ended, and none of them ended with dignity. When the county attorney presented Margaret with a resignation form and instructions to cooperate with the investigation, her last defenses collapsed. She signed with shaking hands, tears threatening but never falling. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said it wasn't over, but even she didn't believe it. The moment she handed the pen back, her power evaporated. She wasn't the HOA president anymore. She was just another person who had let control destroy her. As the officials escorted her to their vehicles, the entire lake seemed to exhale. The tension she had created for years lifted like fog burning off in the sun. Grandpa joined me on the deck afterward, watching the ripples spread across Cedar Lake. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "People in power forget that someone is always watching." Today, she learned the hard way. That was the day Margaret's reign finally crumbled and peace returned to the lake she once tried to control. You said, from the moment neighbors first whispered about Margaret Sullivan's overbearing tactics, it was clear something dark pulsed beneath the calm surface of Lakeside Estates. For years, she operated like an untouchable monarch, issuing fines that didn't exist, inventing violations that weren't real, and intimidating anyone who dared question her authority. But what began as petty harassment slowly evolved into something far more sinister, a pattern of targeted abuse that would ultimately become her undoing. The community had tolerated her power plays far longer than they should have, but the final chapters of her reign were written the moment her ego drove her to cross lines even she couldn't escape from. Everything accelerated when Margaret shifted her focus from small irritations to outright vendettas. She had always enjoyed policing the neighborhood with the self-importance of a sheriff in a one-street town. But once she started using the HOA as her personal weapon, the damage became impossible to ignore. Threatening letters turned into aggressive confrontations. Warnings escalated into unlawful orders, and the fines, dozens upon dozens of them, landed like arrows on the same handful of homes she deemed enemies. People began documenting everything: times, dates, photos, recordings, because they knew that eventually Margaret would corner herself. She believed she was feared. What she didn't realize was that people were preparing for the day she'd slip. The moment of real collapse began, not with a dramatic fight, but with a quiet knock on someone's door. Margaret's harassment had reached a point where she confronted a resident in a way that crossed legal boundaries. Spreads attempts at forced compliance and blatant abuse of authority. When police arrived to investigate, she didn't step back. She doubled down. She talked over officers, tried to order them off her street, and insisted that the HOA gave her powers the law simply didn't acknowledge. Her arrogance was recorded on multiple phones, and those recordings spread faster than wildfire through the neighborhood. For many, it was the first time they'd seen her facade crack. As complaints piled up, county officials stepped in, pulling records, examining financial inconsistencies, and reviewing the HOA's governance. They uncovered a trail of irregularities: money redirected without approval, procedural violations, falsified notices, and misuse of authority. Margaret had been so confident in her ability to control the narrative that she never imagined anyone would dare audit her actions. But the county didn't just find technical errors, they found evidence of deliberate abuse of power. Interviews with residents revealed a consistent pattern of intimidation and retaliation, all stemming directly from Margaret's authoritarian approach. The turning point came during a mandatory hearing, where the evidence against her, documentation, witness statements, financial reports, and recorded interactions painted a chilling picture of a leader who had long stopped serving her community. Margaret, still clinging to her imagined authority, tried to argue, deflect, and accuse others. But the weight of truth was impossible to deny. Officials removed her from her position, and the HOA board voted unanimously to suspend her pending further investigation. Her power evaporated overnight, and the neighbors she once bullied finally breathed freely for the first time in years. But the final blow wasn't administrative, it was legal. Investigators discovered enough misconduct to warrant criminal charges, including harassment, falsifying documents, and financial mismanagement. The day officers arrived to arrest her, the neighborhood watched from behind curtains and porches. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just a quiet, surreal moment where a woman who once treated the community like her kingdom was escorted away in handcuffs. For Lakeside Estates, it wasn't just justice, it was liberation. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like home again.